Blackout. Will was extremely moved by the resurrection of Robert Polsky. He took it as a sign. Why wouldn't he? He had been following a vision for 3 seasons. He likened himself to those monks that set out looking for the Dalai Lama. They followed a series of signs to the newborn spiritual leader. But even that wasn't enough. They had a whole bunch of tests after that. In the 3 seasons of his retreat, he had read through most of the world's scriptures. His reading had diminished a little since he started in on the cigarette business with Cobb, but there was still free time in the evenings and sometimes in the middle of the day. He had sought whatever counsel he could. He had knocked on the doors of the Tibetans, who had a temple in the west end of the city, and he had a good conversation with the aide to the Rinpoche, and he had gone to a synagogue and spoken to a rabbi, who was very nice, and who told him he was probably a Jew in his past life and trying to find his way home. And he had gone to a channeler who told him a 7,000-year-old sage was trying to speak through him. And he had gone to see a Chan master who ran a small temple downtown. And he had told Will that the vision must be forgotten to be understood, that his attachment to the vision was its own albatross. And he had gone to see a Sufi who told him to dance and twirl. And he had gone to see a Catholic priest. And he gave Will sections from the Catholic Encyclopedia pertaining to visions, of which there were 3. Corporeal, in which the vision was seen by the retina of the eye. Imaginative, in which the vision was seen in the human imagination. And intellectual, in which there's just a sense of something with no form. Will decided his was an imaginative vision. And he got roped into dropping off a carton of cigarettes once a week for the father, and he never charged the priest, which pissed off Cobb to no end. All of the full-time and employed holy types gave him recommendations for prayer, meditation, contemplation, and diet. But none could tell him his vision's meaning. It was very cold. It was the kind of cold where you see your breath like you're smoking a cigarette. The heat and moisture of the lungs' expulsion sacked by the air it touches the moment it leaves your mouth. The kind of cold that keeps hands jammed in pockets, even with gloves on. He made it to the donut shop in under 15 minutes. Percy was late. She had called him that day. She wanted to meet. She sounded ecstatic. He was very curious and a bit worried. Rapid mood swings were not a good sign for someone with scars on their wrists. He was halfway through his coffee when she showed up. She got a coffee, sat down, and said, "You're never going to believe what happened to me this week." And then she launched into her story. She had been to the hospital 4 times in the last 6 weeks. It was a dangerous attachment she had developed to Mrs. Rubini. Her job was to treat, not to save, but she couldn't help herself. She voiced her concerns about shock treatment and about Mrs. Rubini's age, but the doctors gave no real comfort. They were empathetic, even a little moved by her sentiment, but in the end, the folks at the hospital know what's right, Percy, Dr. Singh had told her. "We can't get too attached. This is what's best for the patient." And he added, if Percy was intent on fulfilling the 1-year mandate she had set for herself with Mrs. Rubini, it was best for her to observe and draw conclusions on the value of electric shock therapy. The whole thing was a very fortuitous learning experience for her, he felt, as did her mother. They themselves, the hospital, were not fans of ECT either, but it was the world in which they all lived. Percy wanted to move the work co-op into the realm of the family. She wanted to document the emotional effects on Mrs. Rubini's family, especially her husband, who had looked terribly distraught the 2 times she had seen him at the hospital. He and his wife would sit at one of the tables in the cafeteria and cut salami and cheese and eat together and say very little. His face was afflicted with sadness and helplessness. Dr. Singh had nodded his head in empathy again, and they were again moved by her sentiment. But in the end, we are doctors of the mind, Percy, not sociologists. They shocked the old woman, and Percy watched it with a muted disgust. Afterwards, she threw up in the staff washroom, and she assured Will it was nothing to do with her pregnancy. Will had noticed when she sat down that her belly was big enough to give away that she was pregnant. She clothed herself in loose dresses and thick sweaters. She hadn't told her mother. She couldn't keep the secret much longer, though, and the stress of the whole situation was real. The day they shocked Mrs. Rubini, which was the day before Will and Percy's meeting in the donut shop, she placed the car in reverse and pulled out of the hospital parking lot. The large area surrounding the hospital was one of the most pleasant and undisturbed areas of Parkdale. It had a sanctity that was not violated by the vulgarity of the community, a kind of primitive respect like an Indian burial ground, she told Will. The streets were busy, and traffic was stop and start in Parkdale. She felt an anxiety attack coming over her. She'd been fighting with these anxiety attacks for weeks. It can't be good for the baby, she told Will. Most times she would feel a tremendous angst in her gut, and then she would start to feel a tingling in her head, like she was going to lose consciousness. But so far that hadn't happened. When the light turned green, she mustered all of her resolve and strength, put her foot to the pedal, and started to move through the intersection. And then everything went out. The street lights, the traffic lights, the store lights, everything, total darkness. She was, of course, referring to the 20-minute blackout West Toronto had the previous day. On the news, they were trying to calm people, insisting it wasn't an energy shortage in one of the coldest winters in some time, but rather a freak accident that might even have been the result of sabotage. Nobody mentioned terrorists because there was never an intention to harm people, but it passed through everybody's mind. Percy continued with her story. "Oh my God," she thought, "look at what I've done," and she passed out behind the wheel of her mother's Mercedes. When her eyes opened, there was a man in the passenger seat of her car. The window had been broken and the door was still open, letting the biting cold inside. The man said, "It's okay, I'm a cop. My name is Chase. You passed out." She shook her head and sipped her coffee. The thing that struck her the most was what she called the weird symmetry between shocking Mrs. Rubini and the power around the hospital going out right at the end of her shift. And Will agreed that it was an odd thing. But there was more. The man who came to her rescue was a patient of her mother's. That struck Will as quite odd indeed. Her mother was flabbergasted when Percy called and told her the story. Will knew what caused the blackout. He caught Cobb making a bomb from gunpowder he extracted from bullets. He put it all together in the third-floor kitchen of Mrs. Duncan's rooming house. Will tried to talk him out of his decision to go into the sewers and attempt to black out the neighborhood, but Cobb had made up his mind. Several blocks away from where Percy had passed out, and probably only a few minutes after her blackout, a manhole cover slid over and a head the size of a pumpkin popped out and turned from side to side for a quick reconnaissance. The street was empty and black. Cobb popped out of the hole with a flashlight and a toolbox in his hands, and he walked swiftly but casually to where Will, his lookout, had waited with a cell phone. "What a story," Will said to Percy. "Isn't it, though? I mean, what are the chances? It's like a waking dream," Will said. "And so we're going out, me and the cop." "Oh?" Will said. End of chapter.